Yep, it's time we do it again. It's time we do this again. ACNFers, the front runner's officially out. I know, okay? I'd like to think I don't ask for much, but now's the time to buy a copy or 3 or 5. And if you read it, you know the drill. We need ratings, we need reviews. I won't read them because I don't want to be driven insane. I think you understand. But that's the world we live in, ratings and reviews. I'm going to have a new blog post up soon called For Love of Writing Amazon Reviews. And I'm going back through a lot of the books that I read for the podcast and going on Amazon and just giving everybody a short little positive 5-star review. I don't care if you're famous. I don't care if it's your first book. Anyway, your call to action to support the book, me and ye old CNF pod. And if you're still on the fence, and why would you be about the front runner? There's an excerpt of the book, of the main set piece of the book at LitHub. Dig it.
You know, it's the ignorance that I have for a certain period or a certain place or a certain cast of characters that drives me to do these books.
ACNF is a creative nonfiction podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Are we doing it? We're doing it again, aren't we? Honestly, I don't think I could stop. Okay, so many of you know I started this podcast back in 2013, but I didn't get really serious about it until the end of 2016 and at the start of 2017. And I made a list of some titans I wanted to have on the show, and I scribbled in a little pad some names. Some I'm like, at this point, I'm like, I don't really give a shit about that person, and that one kind of annoys me and doesn't need any more attention. But on this list, there's a guy named Hampton Sides, someone who came up in the heyday of Outside Magazine, among other amazing outlets like the New York Times, Nat Geo, the New York Times. Not bad for a Yaley. Says the guy who only got into his safety school. Go UMass. So Hampton Sides is here to talk about his latest book, The Wide, Wide Sea, Imperial Ambition, First Contact, and the fateful final voyage of Captain James Cook. Fucking thing was featured on Barack Obama's, or as we'd say in my native Massachusetts, Obama summer reading list in 2024 when it was in hardback, and now it's in paperback. It should be on your beach read list, which is fitting. As you can imagine, Cook's ships, his fleet, the two Discovery and Resolution, coming into shape on the blue horizon. It's published by Doubleday. Show notes of this episode and more. All right, BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey. Since sunsetting the pod stack, I moved all of that goodness over to the show notes. I'm porting over all of the pod stack stuff to the recent show notes. Like I don't know, there's like 15 or so that need the zhuzh, need the buff. So anyway, that's happening. But when you're there at BrendanO'Mara.com, there, you can sign up for the Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter, the flagship enterprise. Been doing it forever. People who dig it really dig it. Just like this podcast. First of the month, no spam. As far as I can tell, you can't beat it. And you can also consider going to Patreon if you think all this effort is worth a few bucks. Patreon.com/CNFpod. Oh boy. And I also started what's proving to be a pretty popular venture called Pitch Club. It's at welcome-to-pitchclub.substack.com. And I have a writer audio annotate, ideally a cold pitch. I think this has a chance to be pretty special. It's not going to take over the world, but I've gotten the most subscriptions to this kind of thing, like right off the bat. And I was thinking, like, well, why? Well, it's tactical and it's practical. And I've gotten some great emails from people who are like, this idea is genius. And I'm not patting my own back, but like some people have reached out and they're like, this is really, really good. Again, it's tactical and practical. It's going to help narrative journalists, I think, get where you want to go, whether you're emerging or even mid-career. Nick Davidson was the first one to be featured for issue 1, and the National Magazine Award-winning Run on a Tour. Just recorded that one in the can today, and it's a banger. Got a couple more coming with Kim Cross, Cassidy Randall. For now, also just the first of the month, forever free, because I'm not going to gatekeep a resource like this. But buying my book and subscribing to the newsletter and the podcast are a form of currency that I can leverage to actual money. The dogs have vet bills. My sugar mama needs massages, man. So Hampton was great. Not that I expected anything less. There was a moment halfway through where my dogs got the barking and then howling, which made me give them a stern talking to. I think I edited that out. I mean, you're going to hear Kevin barking a little bit in the background. I mean, she's just a beast. And then she gets Lachlan going, and then Lachlan gets Hank going, and then Hank will start howling sometimes, and then Lachlan will howl, and then it's just batshit crazy. I think I edited it out, like I said. Well, at least I should have. I hope I did. I can tolerate a little barking in the background. Call it CNF pod seasoning. Shake a little of that on a podcast, and it's cute. But too much, and it's annoying. And just dries the palate. But howling gets obnoxious. Hampton got a laugh out of it all, I think. He's the author of 8 books, including In the Kingdom of Ice, Hellhound on His Trail, and Ghost Soldiers. On this episode, we talk about how he found his lane in book writing, of transitioning from a journalist to a popular historian, finding the frame, writing in coffee shops, running to the computer in the middle of the night, and an April Fool's Day joke gone horribly wrong. Learn more about Hampton at hamptonsides.com and follow him on the gram at Hampton Sides Author. Great stuff. Had a real fun time. I think Hampton could be the younger brother of Tracy Kidder. Look at them side by side. I'm telling you, it's a thing. They got a similar look. Hampton was recently an instructor at the Archer City writing workshops with Glenn Stout and Kim Cross about reconstructing a historical narrative. So that's where this conversation jumps off from. Parting shot about the compendium and laziness and foot dragging, but for now, cue the montage.
The writing part is where the magic is for me.
The kids these days.
There's a difference between losing and being a loser.
I either work on it or I allow it to torture me for a really long time.
This is going to have to interest somebody somewhere other than me.
It's tough, man. Writing books is hard. And, I don't know that we had any magical solutions, unfortunately, for these people, but we tried to help however we could.
With concerns or things that maybe they were looking to unlock, did you recognize some things that they were struggling with that you have struggled with at times?
Sure. I mean, I struggled for a long time before I got to this point where I'm writing these books. I struggled financially. I struggled structurally with the pieces I was working on. I struggled to find a voice, to find a, what is my subject matter? What is my techniques? It's like trying on clothes. When you're when you're a young writer, early in your career, you're constantly trying to figure out who you are. And a good number of these people in the workshop were younger people who are still kind of struggling with those questions. So maybe I helped in some small way as they move along their path. But I tell you what, growing up, the pathway for a writer was much clearer back then than it is today, both in terms of format and in terms of finances. It was like how you make a living as a writer was a much more straightforward thing. The digital age has sort of changed everything for writers in so many ways, and I don't really know what to recommend sometimes. The world has changed dramatically. Magazines, newspapers, I don't need to tell you that, but it's a different world than the one I grew up in.
Yeah, it's got to be. Even some people ask me, as limited experience as I have, but it's just like I don't know what advice to offer other than just trying to find a way to stay in the game and just learn the timeless skills. The platforms will change, but if you can ground yourself in good research, good reporting skills, writing skills, and interview skills, you give yourself the best chance, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
I love something you said too about certain things that you were struggling with, be it financially or certainly structurally, or finding your lane as a writer. Like, how did you arrive at that, at your particular your particular interest that you were able to kind of leverage into a wonderful book career?
Well, I spent about 25 years working in magazines, writing and editing at various magazines like Outside Magazine, but also writing for National Geographic, writing for newspapers like the Washington Post. And I guess I never really thought I would be a historian. I really thought I'd be kind of a journalist. I spent a decade in Washington D.C. Your education as a journalist is a very good one for becoming a book writer and becoming a historian, because you're dealing with deadlines, you're dealing with editors, you have to turn in pieces, not only on time but with a certain budget in mind, and you're constantly looking for conflict and controversy and things that they're going to give a piece interest among readers. You're also attuned to feedback from the readers of your or whatever magazine or newspaper you're working for. I mean, it's an excellent education for becoming a historian, and I think it's interesting to me how many popular historians today who are getting read and winning prizes and getting on the bestseller list started as journalists, rather than as academic PhD, historians. One day, I learned about a thing that was happening down in the White Sands Missile Range of New Mexico, which was called the Bataan Memorial Death March, and it was a military marathon in the White Sands Missile Range that was to commemorate the real Bataan Death March in World War II in the Philippines. More people from New Mexico than from any other state were killed in the Bataan Death March, because they took the entire National Guard of New Mexico and sent them over to the Philippines just before the war. So the word Bataan is all over New Mexico. You see it on buildings and libraries and all kinds of events that are held. And so I decided to write a magazine piece about this Bataan Memorial Death March for Sports Illustrated. Because I had found that there was a real survivor of the Death March, who was 89 years old, who was going to walk all 26 miles in the desert. And he invited me to come walk it with him and hear his war stories. And so I did, and I walked. 26 miles is 26 miles, man. It's hard, whether you're running or walking it. This guy was in incredible shape for his age, and by the time we crossed the finish line, I was so moved and inspired by his stories and by his account of the war that I had in my mind a book already. It was like I had the beginning, middle, and the end, and I immediately set about working on a book proposal, which became my first book, Ghost Soldiers, which is a book about the prison war camps in the Philippines, the Death March, and then a little known incident late in the war where the U.S. Army Rangers were brought in 30 miles behind enemy lines to rescue the last survivors of the Death March. So that book came out in 2001, my first success, and suddenly I'm a historian. I didn't think of it as history because it was based on interviews primarily with living participants, but ever since then, I've really not looked back. I'm not doing the journalism so much anymore. I consider myself, a popular historian or narrative historian, and I'm going to stick with it. This is it's like a dream job.
Yeah, to be able to kind of like chain smoke book to book to book is like that. That to me is the dream, and I'm in the effort. I'm in the stages of trying to do that myself. But for someone, if you're able to do that, what becomes the flywheel to sustain that kind of momentum? How have you been able to sustain that momentum?
Well, part of it is I don't do the same era or geographical part of the country, or I don't get into much too deep of a groove. I move on to something radically different, and that is fresh to me, keeps me curious, keeps me interested, and perhaps it would be easier if I just kept doing World War II stories or whatever. But it's the not knowing. It's the ignorance that I have for a certain period or a certain place or certain cast of characters that drives me to do these books and keeps it interesting, keeps it new. So that's certainly part of it. although I guess it's all for in its own way, it's American history, but it's all over the map. I'm now
Mhm.
working on a western. I wrote years ago a book called Blood and Thunder, which was about the life and times of Kit Carson. But now after many years now, I don't know, it's been about 15 years. I'm returning to the West and writing a book about the Colorado Territory during the Civil War. Picking your subject matter is one way to keep things fresh and not getting in a rut, not repeating yourself. That's really important to me.
For sure. And how do you go about cultivating ideas for books?
Well, I have a list of books. Just I can't. Books are to me are almost like jokes or like a nice bottle of wine that you say you're going to remember it, but you always forget it unless you write it down. You got to write it
Right.
down.
Yeah.
And I have this sort of master list that I'm constantly revising. And everywhere I go, I'm asking a lot of questions. Often there'll be a little story embedded in something I'm researching that I'll set aside and say, that could be a book there. That could be something bigger. In my earlier days, when I was doing a fair amount of magazine journalism, often those trips, research trips, would lead to an idea. It's like getting out there and asking a lot of questions and keeping this notebook with long lists of possible story ideas is important. Uh, but when you get a little closer to the point where you want to decide to do a book, it becomes a little more intense, sort of the way you kick in the tires and the way you're trying to decide, do I want to spend the next 5 years of my life working on this thing? Um, and I always say, for me, there's kind of like two sides to this thing, two ledgers, two sets of criteria. The first one is completely rational, and the other one is completely irrational. And the rational one is just like little boxes you have to check off. Like, are there good characters? Is there a good story arc? Is there good primary material? Is it something that's of general interest to a large number of people, but also something that hasn't been written about too much? Um, like, oh no, not another book on Lincoln. Like, you gotta find that sweet
Yeah.
spot of a big consequential subject that hasn't been written about too much. So that's kind of the rational side, and then the irrational side is just basically the feeling, the gut feeling, the visceral feeling that you get when you first hear about a story. And it's like falling in love. You just the hair on the back of your neck stands up, and it's like, holy crap, I did not know that, or I want to write that. And
Yeah.
that's to me, the irrational part is equally important as the long laundry list of rational boxes that you want to check off. You
Yeah.
got to have both.
Yeah, it's your point of that falling in love, that honeymoon period. It's like you get that idea and you can't stop thinking about it. And it's like putting a smile on your face. I can't wait to get back to this material. It's just like, it's too good.
Yeah, and you have to have that at the beginning. If you don't, it's going to be really tough sailing two
Yeah.
years, 3 years into your project.
Yeah.
When the honeymoon is over, and you are, yeah, you have good days and bad days. Sometimes you're still fascinated by the subject, but it's hard work at that point, and you better have had that touchy feely kind of early moment to get you through this long ordeal of writing a book, because it's never easy. These books are so hard mentally, physically, spiritually, to get to the finish line. You got to have a lot of irons in the fire and a lot of motivations and a lot of inspiration to get to that other side.
Yeah, and once you're beyond that honeymoon period, and this is so rich to talk about this with people who've written a few books or several in your case, is like, what do those good days look like, and what do the bad days feel like?
Well, of course, there's so much research involved in these books that I go a number of years without writing a word. I mean, I'm traveling, I'm reading, I'm thinking, maybe starting to draw up an outline or a timeline, a chronology of events, uh, organizing my notes, burrowing into it. And then finally, I mean, I guess I would probably have a tendency to research a project forever if because I enjoy the research. If my editor didn't at some point weigh in and say, it's time to start writing. Hello,
Yeah.
there's a contract. So then you start writing. I would say my books are about 3/4 research and sort of mining my research, and then 1/4 writing. I do tend to write pretty fast. I
Mhm.
think that's maybe partly product of magazine journalism and
Yeah.
working with deadlines and being at this point pretty comfortable with my own sort of style, my voice. So I do write pretty fast. And good day would be like 1,000 words, 1,500 words, a reasonably polished draft. Um, a bad day might be 200 words, and perhaps not very good words that you're not too happy with. The important thing is that they're getting words down on the page every day. There's a discipline, there's structure to your week, and I think just as importantly that you are thinking about it at night when you go to sleep. For me,
Mhm.
you're processing so many things. I find at night in your dreams. So when you wake up, often the problem is solved. Whatever the thing you're wrestling with, you can wake up in the morning and get your computer, and your mind is working, even
Yeah.
even when you think it's not. So yeah, I don't necessarily have writer's block. I don't know that I've ever exactly experienced that. But you have good days and bad days. Some days where it just seems like it's flowing and everything's clicking, and those are magical when it happens.
When you're thinking about it before bed and letting your subconscious take over, and then you wake up in the middle of the night, do you like to keep a notebook beside your bed to make sure you're like, oh, that was a good idea. Let's capture that.
I should do that. That would be a good idea, but I don't. I can't say that I do that. Well, I tell you, sometimes though, in the middle of the night, I will race to my computer just to get an idea down.
Okay.
Uh,
Yep.
and I'm not so much about my dreams or whatever, but perhaps I will sometimes just have a really good idea for something I need to add to a story or something I forgot to add in a draft in an earlier version of it. It's that idea of if you don't get it down, you're gonna forget it. You think,
Yeah.
oh, I'll remember that, but you don't. You just don't. Or it just goes right through me if I don't take the time to write it down.
So over the course of eight, yeah, 8 books, it's just such a wonderful body of work, of which I've read about half of them, and it's what would you say you've lessons you've learned from early on in your book writing to where you are now, and what's still challenging to you after all several books.
Well, I think one thing that's happened over the course of those years is that my style has evolved a little bit.
Hmm.
Um, I think when I was younger, I tended to show off more. All
Yeah.
the big words that I'd learned and uh, groovy sentence structures that I was probably cribbing from various writers that I was reading at the time. You know, you're you're turning somersaults and look what I can do with the English language and more verbal gymnastics and things like that. And I think this is normal and typical for younger writers. You in the course of that, you're also just trying to find what is your true voice.
Hmm.
Um, Over time, I've become, I guess, a little less impressed by language, by my language, by $64 words. I've become more streamlined, I think, and more direct, more to the point. Maybe less Faulknerian and more Hemingway-esque or something like that. Shorter sentences.
Yeah.
Um, and I've noticed that because when I don't do this very often, but if I go back and look at my earlier books, there's a lot more. There's some beautiful passages that only a younger person, I think, can write. Because you're first discovering your voice and you're discovering, using certain language for the first time in your life, and it's impressive. But often, I also at the same time I often wince at it. I'm like, God, I would never write that now. That is so purple. It's overdone. It's overcooked, and it's unnecessary. Unnecessary words bother me more and more. Like every word needs to have a function, needs to advance the sentence and advance the momentum and the pace of the chapters in the book. So I think that's one thing that's happened is my style has evolved to become a lot more, more spare and more efficient, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, it's like to become a better writer, you need to almost underwrite and surrender to the story and just be a conveyor of the material that the three
Yeah.
quarters, 75% research you do is just like, it's there. I just need to, convey it and do my best to surrender to it.
And sort of step aside, get out of the way, and let the story tell itself in a way.
Yeah.
Is I feel like more and more that's my role in this thing. But that there are moments in a story still for me that where I need to write hard and write beautifully or evocatively because there's a poetic moment in the story that calls for that kind of language, or there's something beautiful happening in the plot that the writer does have to step in and and enrich it, with the right kind of language, but not as much as I used to in my young days.
Yeah, that's a great way of phrasing it, like enriching it, and be like, yeah, here's a part where we can put a bit more seasoning on this dish that does elevate it and puts your stamp on it instead of like, oh, this could have been written by AI. Like, no, this is Hampton Sides' point of view and style.
I was going to say something about AI. So my most recent book, The Wide Sea, about Captain Cook's third and final voyage around the world. I was turning in the book. I turned in everything but the epilogue, and my editor was not happy with me. This was now 2 years ago,
Mm.
uh, and I noticed that it was coming up on April Fool's Day, and decided to pull a prank on my editor, which was ChatGPT was a fairly new thing, at least to me, and I asked ChatGPT to write my epilogue for me. Ask it a series of very simple questions. Was Captain Cook a good man or was he a bad man? What do the native Hawaiian people think of Captain Cook? And ask it to write this thing. It spat out this term paper that was accurate, factually. The dates were right, the spelling was right, the grammar and syntax were technically correct, but it was robotic, very robotic. I'm sure it'd be a lot better now if I asked ChatGPT right now to do this. It would actually be, light years better than what I found. But so I turned it into my editor on April Fool's Day as a prank, and he took it seriously. It was just crickets for day after day after
Oh
day after
no.
day. Turned out he was calling my agent. They were thinking about calling my wife. They thought I'd had a nervous breakdown. They thought there was something really deeply wrong with me because it was English. It read kind of like something you might write, but there was something deeply wrong with it at the same time. It wasn't human. And finally, my editor called and said we have to have a chat about this, and not a chat GPT, but a chat. And
Yeah.
he, and I finally broke it to him. Like this was a prank. Did you notice the time signature? It said April 1st. But it did. But it was kind of interesting. Now I've heard now students all over America, have written all their papers with Chat GBT so much that you have to write your paper in a classroom, longhand, so that the teacher can see that you actually wrote it. Um, I'm terrified by what AI is going to do to the writing profession and is already starting to do. And I was just trying to have a little fun with it.
Yeah.
But it's actually not a laughing matter. It's actually kind of terrifying, I think, how far it's progressed and how fast and where it seems to all be leading.
Oh, for sure. And yeah, speaking of kind of like analog tools, like below me, I've just got a little reporter notebook, and of course we're recording here. I always love getting a sense of how people gather their information when they're interviewing, whether they're strict analog, John McPheesian kind of no pad and paper, pen and paper, or relying on recorders and everything. I wonder, what balance do you strike on that interview continuum, information gathering continuum?
Well, I try to do both. I mean, if I'm able to tape record somebody talking, then I can let my notes sort of do the color commentary. Like tape recorder's getting the words. I'm writing down what color shirt he's wearing and what's happening in the background, and he's fidgeting with his shoes there, and there's a bird that just flew overhead, or it's a pot of chili cooking on the stove behind him. All that kind of stuff. The recorder kind of frees me up so that I can let my imagination and my observations wander. So I'm doing both. If
Yeah.
possible, both are good. And I like everyone else these days. I certainly use my phone a lot just to take a lot of pictures. It's easy now to do that because you can just fire off 20 shots and then really recreate that room where that interview took place, or the landscape that you're trying to describe. So yeah, I use my phone a lot, maybe too much. I don't know. So I guess I'm both analog and digital in my outlook, and I use both.
Nice. And earlier in our conversation, you were talking about when you're curating a subject to write about, you're like, oh, one of the questions you're asking is like, oh, is there anything new there, or how can you maybe put a fresh spin on it? So that of course brings us to Captain Cook, who has been biographized and written about for decades and decades. But here you were able to lock into this final voyage. So when did you know you had something new to bring to the Cook the Cook canon?
Right. Well, this is kind of a constant tension that I think historians and biographers have, which is, you could probably find some incredibly obscure person who's never been written about, and you could write a biography of that person, and no one's going to buy it because that person is so fringe, so esoteric, so quirky, or off the radar that no publisher is going to want to publish it. No large group of readers is going to want to read it and buy it. On the other hand, there are subjects like Lincoln and Churchill and the Kennedys, or Captain Cook, who have been written a lot about, and the task becomes finding a framing device, finding some way into that story that's never been done before, that allows you to see that figure, that piece of history, in a fundamentally different way. So, yeah, that's what I did with Captain Cook. I decided I was interested in him. I knew very quickly I did not want to write a biography of him, like cradle to grave. I don't do biographies, actually. I needed a story that had a beginning, middle, end, and he had an incredible life even before he started his around the world voyages, and then he had 3 around the world voyages. And I thought, like, that's, in narrative terms, that's not very satisfying. Like, okay, they go out and they come back, and then they go back out again, and they come back, and then they go back out a third time, and then at least his ships return home. Now it's like, that's a Shaggy Dog story. It's too many trips. And so it became pretty obvious that if I needed to pick one voyage, and it was obvious to me very quickly that it would be the third, because it's the most dramatic of his voyages, and it's the longest of his voyages, and it's the most American of his voyages. As an American writer, I needed, even though it's a book about a British captain, a lot of the action happens in present-day United States, particularly Hawaii and Alaska. And it happens during the American Revolution, and a very interesting sort of flashpoint in our relations with Great Britain. So, then I was like, has anyone ever written a book just about the third voyage? That was my next question. And there have been some in England, some pretty stodgy maritime historian books that really more about sailing than anything, nautical tales, but they weren't what I was aiming for. So then I felt a little more sense of relief that I was like, I'm doing something that hasn't been done. It's looking at, you know, there, this one voyage almost like it's the main character. It's a story about a voyage, really. It's not
Yeah.
really about just about Captain Cook. It's about a trip that, like, as we all know, when we go on trips, like some trips have just they take on a life of their own, and the ebb and flow, the highs and lows, the twists and turns of the voyage really becomes the main character. And so that's how I did it. But I did, yes, I was a little bit intimidated by the extent of the literature that's out there. And I realized pretty early on there's just no way I can read it all. I kind of got pulled away all the intervening books and just burrowed down into the primary sources, the diaries and journals of the original participants, and ignored most of the more recent books that have been written about Captain Cook. And I mean, my book wasn't the first, and it ain't going to be the last book on Captain Cook. His voyages were so significant, so ambitious, so consequential in so many ways that there will be many more cookbooks, books about Cook,
Yeah.
to come.
And what did this mission reveal to you about Captain Cook?
This particular, you mean his third expedition? What did it
Yeah, his
reveal?
third voyage. Yeah.
All kinds of things. You see everything about Cook: the good, the bad, and the ugly. In terms of his good qualities, his persistence, his amazing abilities as a captain, as his leadership of men, his concern about diet and hygiene that led to not a single man died of scurvy on this expedition, for example. You see this sort of scientific quality that Captain Cook brings to just about everything. Principally what Captain Cook is a scientist, a map maker, cartographer, astronomer, and mathematician. That's how he rose within the Royal Navy. Those were his real skills, and you see all that on this voyage. It's he's kind of a geek. He's kind of a nerd in a way. Um, but there's something else happening with Captain Cook on the third voyage. He is using the lash more often against his own men. He's having more disciplinary problems. He's got a violent temper that you didn't really see on the first and second voyage. And he's also beginning to use violence against the indigenous people that he encounters along the way. So, why? What is happening with him? A lot of theories have been put forward over the years. The leading theory, and I think the most plausible one, is that he had some sort of parasite that was, he ate bizarre foods all over the world on his voyages, and he probably did have parasites, and they can prevent the absorption of essential vitamins and minerals, and can cause brain damage. And that is a very likely, very plausible scenario, uh, according to a bunch of doctors that I interviewed. His symptoms are indicative of that kind of parasite. So I think that could be what's happening. His behavior had radically changed. Some people, early biographers, have almost compared him to Colonel Kurtz and in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, that he had, was descending in some sort of madness. But that's not quite what's going on here. It's episodic. He has good days and bad days. He has days when he seems like the old Captain Cook, but then something snaps. And this behavior, we see it accelerating, though, near the end of the voyage, and it leads directly to his demise on the Big Island of Hawaii, which is the dramatic kind of end of the book. Most people probably, if they know anything about Captain Cook, they know that he has a bad ending there on the Big Island.
Kind of saying earlier, you wrote early on that I neither lionize, demonize, nor defend him. I've simply tried to describe what happened during his consequential, ambitious, and ultimately tragic final voyage. So that seems like a good and fair rubric where you're just like, here's the story, here are the beats, but I'm not going to lay judgment. And so I kind of like that approach, and I imagine that was very strategic early on for you.
Yeah, I mean, I was writing this book and researching this book while Captain Cook's statues were coming down all over the place.
Right.
He was in the news again, and I thought at first, well, I wondered, is this good or bad for my project here? My it's not a biography, but he is the protagonist of the story, and now he's extremely controversial and being canceled from a lot of these cultures, and being removed from history in a way. So, his exhibitions, exhibits are being reassessed and sometimes pulled from galleries and museums, and certainly he's being reassessed as part of this larger critique of colonialism and the excesses of the imperial game that was played during the 17 and 1800s. So yeah, I decided to kind of try to understand, where that critique is coming from, and incorporate it wherever I could into the story, if it sort of organically worked into the narrative. I certainly also tried my damnedest to bring in the indigenous perspective on these encounters. They were mutual discoveries. We in the past have only focused on the European side of the question, but the Polynesians, for example, they were discovering Europeans. They were learning about metal and money and alcohol and these huge wooden ships that were full of nails and rivets. It's a mutual discovery going on, and I tried to make it that try to cover both sides of the question as best I could. It's hard when you're dealing with an oral society, oral history, an oral tradition. There's not as much written material, but wherever I could find it, I used it, and I think it's just an infinitely better story because of it. I think we need to. It's not an either or proposition. It's both. We need all the perspectives that were relevant at the time to be incorporated in the narrative.
Yeah, and one particular character takes a lot of real estate in the story, and I don't know if his name's pronounced May or Mai.
My
Mai.
my
He was a fascinating man. I don't know. Just tell us a little more about him and his arc in this story.
Yeah, so Mai is a really important character in the book. He's probably the second most important character. He's a Polynesian man. He's from Tahiti, and he becomes the first Polynesian to set foot on English soil as part of Cook's second voyage around the world. He becomes a hit in England. They roll out the red carpet for him. They have him vaccinated for smallpox. He meets King George III. He meets all the writers and thinkers and scientists who study him and admire him, but also sort of patronizingly analyze him to see if he's a good example of the noble savage, as they call it. He learns to hunt at the estates of the aristocracy. He is a mean backgammon player, a mean chess player. He, for the most part, has a ball in England and has a great experience. But after 2.5 years or so, he becomes quite homesick and wants to go back to Tahiti. King George III says, "We'll get you home, and Captain Cook will be your chauffeur." And he, not only of Mai, but now all these belongings that Mai has accumulated over 2.5 years, all kinds of weird things like a full suit of armor, and guns and ammunition and swords and all kinds of trinkets and baubles and little cool little things like a jack in the box, and horses, a lot of animals. King George wanted the Tahitians to have like a British farm, like an English farm. So Captain Cook has to transport horses, goats, sheep, peacocks, all kinds of animals. So the holds of the ship are just unbelievably stinky and loud and chaotic with all these animals. It's like Noah's Ark. But yeah, is for me it was really interesting because it allowed me to have as a main character a Polynesian, an indigenous person who is, usually the stories are about the English people going to observe, let's say, people of color or whatever. In this case, you have the person of color going to England and being an observer of in the heart of whiteness, like meeting all these blindingly white people in their wigs and their tricorn hats and their full regalia, and so we get Maya's point of view on English society, and I think it kind of enhances this study of cultural clash that is really what the book's about. It's really about the wide gulf between these cultures, perhaps unbridgeable gulf, and how it plays out in the life of this one man, Mai.
Mm. I love that you bring up the capital A word, about, and that's always so central to kind of summing up succinctly what a story is. It gives it an engine. When did you arrive at that capital A about when you were writing and researching this book?
Well, I started working on this, and I found that I was not writing a whole lot about the sailing, the trip. It's at sea, the storms, the all the things about a ship or ship architecture of those times. I mean, I found that I was more interested in was what happens when a ship approaches an island. In that moment of first contact, that magical moment when anything could happen. Are they going to get along with each other? Are they going to go to war? Are they going to trade? Are they going to what are these experiences going to be like? And in both directions, there's this kind of exciting moment, and it's a moment that Captain Cook had many times. Most of these captains of this time, they might have had one or two of these first contact experiences, but Cook had like 30 or 40, maybe 50 of them. That's what I decided I was more interested in. Is like, this is not a nautical story so much as it is a story about once the ships land, the these two cultures face each other on the shore, and what's going to happen? Usually it worked out for Cook. It's amazing how often and how well it worked out for Cook until one day it didn't. Didn't work out. So that's really the theme of the book more than anything. I mean, of course, I describe what it's like to be on board these ships and all that, but I don't get deep into the. I leave that to Patrick O'Brien and some of these other writers who really know how to write about every inch of a ship and what's going on and with the spritz and the spars and all the different sails and what to do in a storm and all that kind of stuff. I'm more interested in what happens on shore than what happens on board the ship.
Well, it's the way you write it too, and in hearing you speak about it, just how wild and terrifying it must be to see these giant ships coming in if they haven't been introduced to such a thing before. But even but even some these mega canoes that get paddled out with very surveying these ships. It is so charged with tension, and just to kind of put yourself there and to visualize it, it's just like, wow, it's what a sight to behold, really.
Yeah, it was a spectacle, and Cook was very intrigued by the Polynesians because he recognized in them a very sophisticated nautical society. These people knew how to build ships, very different kinds of ships, without any metal, without any nails. But he was impressed by their ship architecture and the elegance of these canoes, and how versatile they were in war and as fishing vessels. And he talks a lot about that. But it works in both directions, because the Polynesians are amazed by the Cook ships. They're huge, and they're full of iron, and full of just these giant sails. And at first, there's all kinds of oral history that the Polynesians thought they were from outer space, or that they emerged from the bottom of the sea, or that they were some kind of otherworldly creatures, because they just never seen ships like this. And they never seen, for example, clothes that had pockets in them. And there's this oral history. They say, look, they reach into their bodies and they pull out treasures. They were just amazed at kind of just the stark, cold cultural differences between the cultures and what they wore. And they like Cook's men were constantly smoking pipes and cigarettes, and they didn't understand that. And they call them the volcano people, because they're always seething from their mouths like a volcano. So yeah, I mean, there's the cultural divide was vast at first and interesting, and it was kind of weird, actually. And but then, of course, over time, the two cultures understand that they're just mere mortals, and they're all human, and for the most part, they get along. They're until, as I say, near the end, everything unravels for Cook on Hawaii.
Yeah, because by that point, they had essentially overstayed their welcome. And even though, Cook was basically treated like a god, and the lono, 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 the chanting of the Hawaiian god. And yeah, they overstay their welcome, and then they leave, but then they come back.
Yeah. Right. Well, Cook finally understands, and generally speaking, he was pretty good about detecting when he had overstayed his welcome. He moved on, but unfortunately, 2 days later, they encountered a gale, and the foremast of his ship, the Resolution, snapped in half, and it was a catastrophic problem that had to be solved. And he didn't know what else to do but to turn around and go right back to that same bay, Kealakekua Bay, on the Kona coast of the Big Island, and have his ship repaired, because he knew there were good trees there, and his carpenters were going to go out and cut down a tree and fix the mast. But by the time they get back to that bay, the Hawaiians are like, "Wait a minute, what are you doing here? You're a god out of season. You're, the big festival, the religious festival called the Makihiki, it's over now, and you're supposed to be gone. If you are Lono, I'm not convinced that all the Hawaiians thought he was Lono, but I think perhaps the priests were pushing that narrative as like this was the god returned, and but now he's come back at the wrong time, at the wrong place. And furthermore, like, clearly you're not a god if your ship broke. You got, and so you're going to come back. Bringing your men back, and you're just like they've been consuming their pigs and having fornicating with their women and drinking their water, their fresh water, and it's just like, no, we're done with you. So Cook and his men are treated very differently from then on, and things escalate in a hurry. A rowboat is stolen. Cook storms ashore to try to get it returned, and decides to try to kidnap the king of Hawaii and bring him ashore and hold him for ransom. His bodyguards, the king's bodyguards and warriors, surround him and prevent that from happening. And then things escalate from there. I don't want to go into all the details of what happened, but it is an incredibly violent, incredibly graphic death that Cook's own men, for the most part, are witnessing from the ships, just too far away to to help him or to defend him. And it's like they're watching a terrible, tragic scene from a Greek play against the amphitheater of this huge steep cliffs, and they can't prevent it from happening. And so yeah, and it's pretty shocking when you go down to the site of all this. It's not easy to get to, but it's there's some bad juju there. There's still some kind of
Mhm.
unfinished business. You get this feeling that it's a place that's considered sacred to the ancient Hawaiians, to the native Hawaiians, but it's also where this terrible event happened, where not only Cook was killed, but numerous of his Royal Marines and over 20 Hawaiian warriors were killed that day, right there on the lava flats. And it's I don't know, it's a pretty epic place in a lot of ways.
Mm. Well, Anthony, I just got a couple more things for you.
Yeah.
When you've got all your materials and you're setting down to write, what what do you like to have in place as you look to access these materials and get in maybe a good cracking 1,000, 1,500 words if the day's going good.
Yeah. Well, one thing I've found that really helps me, especially with this book, was to have a kind of a condensed document, which is like all the quotes that I want to use from all the different sources, all in one place. So it's almost like an artist, has to have a palette with all his paints right there on the palette, so that you can dip in and use those quotes. And I don't have to hunt for them all over the place among 15, 16, 17 different sources. It's all there. It's all condensed. And so I spent a lot of time developing that condensed document. I mean, it takes me probably more time to get all that stuff compressed down to a few pages than it takes me to actually write the chapter.
Yeah.
But it allows me to, once I start writing the chapter, it goes a lot faster and a lot easier, more smoothly. That's one thing. I tend to do chronologies, or like a timeline. I like to have that kind of running over here as kind of a separate document of like, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, because you often forget the order of things, the sequence, and the exact times and dates and things like that. So it's nice to have that as a sort of a cheat sheet or whatever. I tend to write in coffee shops. I need noise. I need stimulation. I need caffeine. And although I do have a perfectly good office and I do write in my office, I often have to just leave the house or I go stir crazy. And I have a series of coffee shops that I go to. I put on headphones. I give people the evil eye if they want to look like they're going to come over and talk to me, because I don't want that. I don't want to be rude, but I'm in my office, dude. I'm working here, and uh, uh, once I get in the flow of things, yeah, the writing comes pretty fast. Usually, I would say typically it's about 750 words. That's like a solid thing to shoot for, but consistently.
Yeah, that seems like a manageable amount where you're not totally bleeding the well, but you can come back to that every day, and you don't have the muscle soreness that you might from an anaerobic bout of writing.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't do all-nighters anymore. I'm used to, and when I was younger, I would, have a big deadline and really push it to the end and then stay up all night or something. And then you pay for it the next day or the next few days. I think consistency is what you're really shooting for. If you can, the pages add up pretty quick. If you can get 750 words every day for a couple of weeks, you're doing good.
Oh, fantastic! Well, Hampton, I always love bringing these conversations down for a landing by asking the guests for just a recommendation of some kind for the listeners, and that can just be anything you're happy about that you're like, oh, this is a cool thing I've been trying out, or TV show or whatever. So I would just extend that to you as we bring our conversation down for a landing.
Well, maybe the best piece of advice I ever got was from from this guy, the first writer I ever met growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, who was a great narrative historian. His name was Shelby Foote. He wrote this amazing trilogy of the Civil War, and he was like the star of Ken Burns' documentary on the Civil War. He had this amazing beard and pipe and Delta accent, and he was just this exotic creature. And I was a kid growing up in Memphis, and his son was a good friend of mine, and we'd go over there and hang out, and we were in a rock band together, and we were sort of doing everything we could to prevent Shelby Foote from finishing his amazing trilogy of the Civil War. But I interviewed Shelby later for a magazine and did a series of interviews with him, and he talked about how important it is for a writer to write the story and not to talk about it. And he said it's like, he knows a bunch of writers, he said, people who wanted to have written a book. But instead, what they ended up doing is going to cocktail parties and dinner parties, talking about this project that they're going to be writing, and they're going to, basically talking it out. Almost, he said it was like a pressure cooker that's cooking green beans. You got to let the pressure build up inside, or the beans will never get cooked. And the analogy was that they're letting the pressure off bit by bit by bit by bit by talking about it, and then they just talk it to death, and the thing never gets written. And I do know a lot of people who, I don't know, they're aspiring writers. They talk a lot about their projects in public, and somehow it often doesn't get written. I think you got to build up the pressure to cook the green beans, and for me, it involves not talking very much about my current project, whatever it is. I feel like I'll never write it if I keep yakking about it, to other people. I'm also a little bit superstitious. I'm always worried that, maybe somebody else will get the idea, or, it'll be out there in the ether, and someone will find out about it and beat me to it. So even after all these years, I'm a little superstitious about talking about my current project. And I think that was a good piece of advice, though. It's like writers should write and not talk. It's about getting words down on the page.
Well, I love that sentiment, and and it's just so great to talk writing and talk about your latest book, Hampton. I've been a fan of your work for years, and it's such a great time to talk a little shop and get into your head a bit about how you go about this kind of work. So just thanks for all the work you do, and thanks for carving out some time.
Well, thanks for your interest. It's a fun way to make a living. I'll tell you that. I love what I do. I feel extremely lucky, and I guess I'm just going to keep doing it until I croak. I don't know what else to do. I'm honestly not good at anything else, but I'm going to keep doing this until someone tells me I can't.
Yes, awesome. Manic energy in the studio today. Manic energy. Great talk. I hate having to cut off these conversations at an hour because I feel like I have enough threads to pull on for another 2 hours. That's what it felt like with Hampton. Like, he was saying certain things, I'm like, God damn it, that'd be a good thing to maybe another time. But that's how we roll. That's how we do it. Another time, man. I love between book pods. That's a really rich time to be talking about writing. Find out more about this historically great badass at hamptonsides.com. Clear my throat. Okay, so I'm filling out the compendium for the next biography. And there are some dry days. I've been going a few days in between without doing anything, so I don't really have much to add to the thing. I don't write it in every day, especially of late since I've been tied up with Frontrunner promo and the usual self-loathing and inertia to do nothing but wash dishes and tend to my ever-growing list of house chores. Let me get my compendium out here. Big book. It's a big book. Like, literally big. It's just big. But the compendium was always a way to catalog what I'm doing, and just as importantly, what I'm not doing. I probably have about 5 hours of tape strung across 4 key sources. I have the numbers for close to a dozen sources. I have yet to dive into the transcripts of what I have and draw up a baby proposal, which thankfully is all my agent feels she needs. The subject is big enough, and having stuck the landing on the front runner, a solid overview and proof of sourcing, and possibly some tasteful nudes will seal the deal. Here's a sampling from the compendium. That's from the last few days. I'm not going to read everything, but here are some things. Like from Sunday, May 25th, merely checking in. The only thing I did since Tuesday was acquire an email from this guy. He's a summer coach. He's undergoing treatment for cancer. We will talk this week after Memorial Day, trying to show some grace from myself, given that the front runner has launched, soft launch, like a soft restaurant opening. Still feeling out the best way to organize this compendium. I love the idea. I just feel it could be in better shape. Okay, Wednesday, May 28th, checking in again. We'll talk to so-and-so tomorrow at noon. Been hard finding focus with book stuff going on. Next 2 days will be pretty crazy, so expect this one and this one conversation to be the only one done that week. On Thursday, May 29th, did a few things, spoke to a source, intro call. We'll have a, quote, better one in about 10 days. I made a good impression on him. If I give myself credit for anything, I guess it's that. Tuesday, June 3rd, emailed that guy. Wednesday, June 10th, spoke for 90 minutes, and he shared photos and stats. Great talk, great photos. Getting close to having enough for a baby proposal. Been dragging my feet, and I can't afford to do that. I can't shake the feeling that I'm just being lazy. You know, my out-of-the-box software isn't the most rigorous. I go back to my days playing ball. It always comes back to baseball, doesn't it? Like when I was really killing it. I worked exceptionally hard, for a high schooler. Then I got onto a competitive college roster, and combined with being redshirted and burnt out, I failed to level up when I needed to level up again. Now everyone is good or great, and you have to work even harder. I failed to work harder because, I was a walk-on. They didn't let the walk-ons practice. But when there was a fall ball, if you outperform the recruits, like I was at one point, the coach isn't necessarily impressed. He's actually embarrassed, and it wounds his ego. Like, he gave full boats to these other guys that this chump, me, is outperforming, and he can't possibly cut the recruits. But the guy who walked on without a scholarship, no ego tied to that guy, yeah, we can cut his ass. I needed to work triple hard to stay on par with the others who might not have been doing as well, which I suspect is how women and minorities feel in the workforce when going toe-to-toe with white dudes. But yeah, meritocracy is what we favor. Yeah, right. Point being, my hard work, Point being, my hard work, pivoting to the writing thing, hard work and luck got me 6 weeks in Saratoga. We'll call that 2011. But I had a long grind, had to grind longer, work harder, get luckier for the front runner. And now there's no coasting. I have to work even harder for this next one to stay in the game. I have to level up again. The sourcing for this book will likely number close to 1,000 if I do it right. Pre was closer to 200, just in terms of talking to people. Nobody wants to read a doorstop, so the book will likely be under 400 pages, but the sourcing could fill 1,000. Yeah, that's addition by subtraction. That's leaving a book's worth of material on the floor. That's being ruthless. That's the hard work. In any case, the compendium is me holding my feet to the fire. Oh, you only made 10 calls today? You need to make twice that. You need to average about 2 interviews a day to get the material you need to make this a compelling narrative biography. Listen, you're at an age where you can assume the mantle as a preeminent sports biographer. Why not go for it? Be in and of that class. Shoot for that shit. Don't sandbag yourself because you feel like a fraud. Do it for the others if you can't get out of your own fucking way. If I can further elevate my standing, I'm pulling the podcast with me, and the podcast pulls the others. I hope I can open doors and bust the fucking deadbolts, because I never want doors slamming behind me. Like and subscribe. Stay wild, CNFers, and if you can do, interview. See ya.